What is the rocket and feather effect?
So the rocket and feather effect, or rocket and feather pricing, is a phenomenon that I think we all recognize, but it's largely misunderstood by the public, politicians and the press. And what that phenomenon is where oil price volatility enters into the market, as we have at the moment with the conflict in Iran. And what consumers and motorists observe are those prices rocketing up at the beginning of the conflict, and then those prices, once oil prices in particular have settled back down to their pre-conflict levels, they see a rather long tail where those prices take much longer to come down than they did to go up.
So if it's not profiteering, what's actually driving the rocket price?
So the rocket phase is really interesting because what you see when you look at the data are three factors at play. The first being the wholesale price itself. So the press get really focused on the movements in the oil price, but the price of petrol and diesel are in themselves traded commodities on the open market. And what happens in the wholesale price is, as the oil price starts to rise, that sends a supply signal into the oil and petroleum market that there's going to be an issue with supply in the near future. What then happens is you see the buying signals come from wholesale traders and distributors that starts to bring that price up very, very quickly. What happens at the same time as that is that motorists, members of the public like you and me, start to get wind of the fact that petrol prices are likely to rise in the near future. What then happens is we all go to our nearest petrol station because we want to lock in the price when it's still cheap, and we effectively suck out all of the cheap fuel from the supply chain, from our local petrol stations, but also through the storage locations across the country very, very quickly. And we suck through that more expensive wholesale cost that has come through, which is why you have the rocket effect in the initial phase. There's also then a second stage of the rocket where after a few weeks, fuel retailers typically find that their margins have actually been put under a lot of pressure. Some retailers even move into what's known as negative margin, where they lose money on fuel. And what you then see is a second bump of that rocket where fuel retailers do increase their margins, but what they're increasing them to is back to the levels they were pre-conflict.
You mentioned consumer behaviour. Are you saying that motorists actually contribute to price increases?
Unintentionally, yes. And it's simply down to the fact that millions and millions of motorists behaving in a different way disrupts the supply and demand pattern from the consumer side. So you've got not only the disruption from the supply side due to the war, but you also have disruption at the demand side due to consumers all of a sudden sucking out that cheap fuel, putting it into their cars, and allowing those more expensive wholesale prices to flow into the local forecourts much quicker than they typically would.
There's a strong perception that retailers make more money when prices go up. Is that wrong?
It is wrong, because what we see, and at Edge Data we've been observing two distinct periods of price increases over the past 12 months, where tensions in the Middle East caused oil prices to ratchet up very quickly. And what we see is retailers actually acting as a buffer to the market. They don't really want to pass on prices straight away to their customers. What fuel retailers like is something called price stability, where they've got consistency of price. And what they do in that initial phase is they actually take a hit on their margins. So in July last year, we saw retailers drop their margins by 17.5% when there was an initial conflict in Iran in last summer. And what we've seen with the most recent conflict is exactly the same pattern play out. Within the first 4 weeks of the current conflict with Iran, you see the the retailer margins drop by over 18%. And as I've said, in some cases, those retailers were moving into negative margin or loss-making territory because they were trying to maintain prices not only at a lowest possible level for their customers, but they were also trying to compete in their local markets with competition such as supermarkets and some of the larger operators.
And why would retailers absorb these costs instead of passing them on immediately?
So essentially what retailers are always trying to do is to try and find that right balance. They're competing in local markets. Not all fuel retailers are purchasing fuel on the same purchase terms. Some are buying on a spot price, that day's price. Others have a lag. And you can't then simply just pass on the price immediately onto the customer. There's also a community aspect to it. Most of the retailers that Edge Petrol and Edge Data Pro serves are local, small, medium-sized, family-run businesses, and they operate and live in their communities. They don't want to pass those prices on. So initially they take that hit in the hope that the oil price and the wholesale petrol price will actually come down. And if that doesn't happen, eventually those price increases do need to be passed on.